Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and this is the Backlog. This week I finally did it. I finished up the Mega Man Zero ZX collection by finishing the final title, ZX Advent. This one might have caused me the most misery out of any of them, which, if you watched any of the other episodes where I discussed these, is really saying something. So let's go over why my playthrough had me constantly repeating the words garbage and crap. Let's start with the story. Like before, you're I presume, teen? Either the human girl Ash or the Reploid boy Gray. You're either going about your life as a bounty hunter as the former, or just awakening from your capsule as the latter when stuff happens and you come across the Biometal Model A, who offers to merge with you to grant you his powers to get you out of a dangerous situation, much like Model X did in the previous game. Since I chose Vent in the last game, I went with Ash this time since their stories intersect, so that's gonna be how I talk about the game going forward. Anyway, soon she's drawn into a conflict involving pseudoroids, animal-esque robots that serve as the game's main bosses, and other Mega Men, people who have merged with biometals to gain the powers of past heroes. The goal of all the fighting is to sow chaos, fear, and death to feed Model W, the evil biometal from the last game. When fully awakened, it will allegedly grant the one controlling it to remake the world in their image, and each of the other Mega Men want to become the strongest Mega Man to become the Mega Man King and claim Model W for themselves. And if it sounds stupid, well, I'm not done yet. In addition to the story's quality, the game also has bad voice acting. Amateur is the only way I can think to describe it. While it's bad, it's not hilariously bad like Mega Man 8 or X4. There is nothing redeeming about it. In addition to that, it also seems like they gave no damns when translating the dialogue. So much of it sounds awkward or banal or like it thinks it's smarter than it is. The whole thing might be terribly written, but then again, I swear I've heard lines similar to some of the ones here in anime and they've worked. So there is a chance that this was just part of a bad translation. Them being transcribed in English, being tweaked slightly so that they make sense, but no effort actually being put into making them sound good or like something somebody would actually say. Altogether, you have a triple threat, making every single cutscene unbearable, and this bleeds into the characters. The main theme of the story seems to be fighting against destiny and creating your own story, which is fine, I guess. Kinda basic like the last game, but not a terrible message. With Ash not knowing anything about her past, it's understandable that she'd want to create her own tale and gain some fame, but the way she's written makes her sound really narcissistic. She also has the main character trope of being combative and quick to goad into a fight, but she comes across as having small dog syndrome or an actual personality disorder. I've seen this sort of thing a lot, and I typically don't mind, maybe even like, these sorts of characters, so I really just want to blame the writing. How the other characters interact with her is also pretty troubling, so many of them concentrating on her being a woman. Some seem desperate to spend time with her because of her sex, some bosses criticize her for being a girl, and a few characters try to be overly considerate of this, making it super awkward. As for the other Mega Men, they range from forgettable to really irritating. The Model P, Phantom user, is a robot that talks like a robot with no personality of his own, and that's it. The Model F, Fefnir user, wants to fight, and that's pretty much her whole personality. The Model L, Leviathan user, wants to help nature, being perfectly fine torturing or killing as many people as need be in the process, but will be on the verge of tears himself if he loses. The Model H, Harpuya user, might be the worst of all. He claims to want to correct the world, and when you ask questions, he just calls you stupid while answering none of them. He talks a lot but never actually says anything, making him the edgy bad guy equivalent of that one guy that quotes buzzwords while not knowing what any of them mean, and thus making everything he says meaningless. The returning characters also feel greatly diminished. Pandora and Prometheus seem like legitimate threats before, but here they're tied so closely into the stupid plot that they themselves feel more stupid than scary. Vent's there, but feels more like a cameo in someone's fanfic, where the real main character shows up to say how cool Euros he is, become friends with them, and somehow get defeated by the new, less experienced, and less powerful character to further hype them up. And the main villain is kinda generic, super evil guy with a god complex that somehow manages to feel like the best written character, probably due to how their appearances are pretty infrequent, and just how poorly the rest are portrayed. Pretty much every element of storytelling in this game is a travesty. As for actual gameplay, before you get Model A, you play as plain ol' Ash. Like Ven in his human form, she can jump and crawl into tight spaces, but she also has a basic gun she can use to plink enemies. It's nice that she isn't completely helpless, but like much of the last game, you don't want to use this form unless you specifically need to. Which brings us to Model A. This gives Ash guns that, when charged, will fire a shot that bounce off walls like the Gemini laser. This can actually cut down on the need to aim, because even if you missed in an enclosed space, your beam can still easily hit with a ricochet. You can also spend some weapon energy, which refills over time, to scan multiple enemies and hit them all with a lock-on attack. There's also a charged version of this that locks you in place as you unload your guns all around you. More notable than that though is its ability to copy the form of defeated bosses to grant you their appearance and abilities, called the A-Trans system. This is a really cool idea that somehow has been made completely unpleasant, almost as if on purpose. One of these reasons was something I mentioned for the last game as well, that there are very specific tasks that you need these forms for, causing you to stop everything, scroll to the one you need, do the thing, then stop again to swap back, really breaking up the game's forward momentum. Then there's how unlikable most of the characters are. Despite all the things I complained about with her, Ash is still one of the better characters in the game. Rather than just changing to another biometal but staying the same character in different armor, like the last title, here you completely change into the douche Harpuya cosplayer or psychotic crybaby, which just adds a layer of suck to the process. Then there are the more animalistic pseudoroid bosses. Turning into a giant T-Rex robot and chomping down on things with your giant ice teeth sounds neat, but when you walk slow, attack slow, and can't fit into most spaces, the option is really more annoying than fun. And that's how most of them work. Either too slow, moving too erratically, or having next to no utility other than very specific obstacles thrown in just to make their use a necessity. The final mark against this system is actually Model A himself with his personality. Between his voice and speech patterns that they give him, he comes across like a little brother character. In games with good writing, this might be endearing, but here, it's another irritant. It's especially bad when you get a new transformation, and he spends about 3 times longer than necessary explaining its functions. At first, I listened so that I wouldn't miss anything, then I started getting fed up and skipping the scenes, relying on just either hitting buttons until I figured out what I could do, or if I still didn't understand something, I'd just pause because there were much more succinct explanations in the pause menu, making Model A's dialogue very unnecessary. The visuals are largely the same as the last game, just with darker and duller colors, since Advent seemed to want to up the level of edge. The music definitely has the same style as the other ZX title, but the soundtrack just didn't grab me as much. Maybe there's a degradation of quality here, but I suspect it's more me just not liking the game nearly as much. A great game is a combination of many different elements, from gameplay, characters, graphics, story, sound design, music, and more, and while each part can be good on their own, when working in harmony, they enhance each other and become more than the sum of their parts. So honestly, this OST might be just as good as the previous one, but given how flawed the Advent experience is, it might just not have clicked with me as much as its predecessor. It still has some bangers though, and is worth a listen. The map is much better in this game. It's laid out in a way where you can tell much easier roundabout where things connect. It'll even give you little marks on the blanked out sections that give you a general idea of where you're supposed to go to advance the plot. It ain't perfect, and sometimes you still do need to mill around until you find the exact door or path that connects areas, but it's still a step up. Most sections also have warp points that you can spend energy crystals on to activate. These are a little odd since you can only warp to them, not from them, and it doesn't save them when you get game overs. But I guess you could always backtrack to save and then teleport in, or turn one on near an upgrade that you need to come back for later. They're just not as helpful as one might expect. As for the missions, those work a bit better this time around too. You don't need to select one at a save station. Instead, you can just enter an area and get right to it, cutting down on wandering, hoping to find the exact area you need considerably. The weird part is just how they tie into the story. They'll give you a basic goal, and then you'll go off and do something that seems really unrelated, like having to collect plane parts to repair a train, then having to travel over a river of ice and climb a tower. Both coming out at a random way station, but you needing to clear each to get past that. Everything I did always seemed kinda random, but this could have been another example of bad translation or me zoning out when people talked, and really it's a video game. You don't always need deep reasons for there to be levels. The game just probably annoyed me to the point where I really wasn't willing to cut it much slack. There are also some side missions that you get from NPCs, but I typically did not care enough to do these, only completing them if I just happened to run across whatever object they wanted me to find for them. On the difficulty, I'd say it's decently challenging. I was able to blaze through ZX no problem, only getting game overs in the later levels. Here though, just about every stage required at least one retry. A lot of the difficulty felt more annoying than challenging though. I was pleased that the last game gave you enough time to react to enemies that were off screen, but here the Zero series habits of placing enemies out of sight only to attack you either right as or before they actually become visible is back. In addition to that, there's a lot more need to constantly be swapping forms. There are more annoying mechanics like wind, levels covered in spikes, and low visibility. A lot of the sub-bosses are obnoxious. The bosses themselves can be kind of annoying. Most are learnable, but a few are really rough. There's one in particular that you fight underwater, with them having full range of the field, while you yourself have only 3 small platforms to hop between that I had to figure out some cheese to deal with. And just about all of them, no matter how much you get them down, can sometimes just use the wrong combination of attacks to completely screw you over to deal some pretty unfair feeling damage. More than that though is just what a shit show the final stage is. It starts out with a hallway, not super long, and while there are a few places for you to take some cheap hits, not too hard. Then there's the boss rush, with the 8 pseudoroid bosses. That is a lot, but doable, either by getting the encounters down pat or filling up some sub-tanks to compensate for the trickier ones. After that is another hallway that is about the length of a full level on its own, with no checkpoints, a new mechanic thrown in, and a ton of insta-deaths requiring a lot of tricky maneuvering, with no room for screw-ups. Then there's the final boss, with the first form that has no health bar, so it can be hard to judge how well you're doing and how much you want to commit, and a second form that requires a lot of effort just to make them vulnerable to attack. Game over on any of these sections and you have to do it all over again. First part, not too bad, just mostly an annoyance. Second part, really challenging when you're still learning patterns, then becoming tedious as you get them down and just have to do it over and over again. The third part is the worst by far. And the final part is not too bad, but if you're not prepared and don't have a strategy going in, you can easily die and lose all your progress. Honestly, all they would have had to do was split this stage up, giving you a hard as nails stage leading into it, then making the boss rush and final be its own stage, like a regular frickin' Mega Man title. And the whole thing would have been still frustrating at points, but acceptable. Instead, it is just way too unbalanced and a huge time sink. It took me around 9 hours to beat the full game, and 3 of them were just this final stage, with stinks of just having a hugely disproportionate level of difficulty. I was already not having a good time with the game, and this very nearly made me lose my mind. I was honestly 1 try away from calling the stream and just posting the good run whenever I managed it later on as a Let's Play. But I somehow strangled out a win while being lightheaded from the frustration and having my spirit largely broken. Horrible, horrible, horrible game, with the worst somehow being largely concentrated in the last leg of it. That's the end of the Zero ZX collection, a very sour note to go out on. 03 wasn't too bad, and ZX was borderline easy compared to the rest, but most of them were really hard, either unintentionally due to how it was formatted, unfair challenges that required either memorization or precognition, areas strewn with insta-death, and just overall being very unforgiving. The whole thing seems very unbalanced when it comes to difficulty, and it really gives off an impression of masochism. Inti Creates also worked on Mega Man 9 and 10, where they took out the charge shot, present in most classic titles, and the slide, which was in all the previous games other than 1, the jankiest one, and the highly overrated 2. All of this gives me the feeling that they make their titles clouded by nostalgia, Only in their case, the element they gravitated towards was how hard old Mega Man games were, and this caused them to just amplify it. Most of the old ones have a better balance of difficulty. Mega Man is supposed to be able to slide to give him more options and actually be able to dodge attacks. While never guaranteed, enemy drops were never super stingy. The boss rush is normally its own thing. While memorizing patterns is important, you don't normally have to memorize a whole stage to react to things that aren't even on screen. And in games in general, if you're expected to die over and over again, don't erase so much progress that when you do, you're just stuck doing the same thing over and over again until things start to become repetitive. When you die in Celeste, you normally lose less than a minute. With Cuphead, at most it's 3, with the exception of King Dice. Even with older Mega Man titles, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a level that takes longer than 5 minutes, but here, so many times, it feels like you invest in doing a stage only to have the game shove you down and tell you to do it all again, wasting chunks of time in the process. I don't know, I'm sure better players at the game will tell me to just get good, but a lot of what they put you through feel either cheap or like artificial difficulty rather than a finely crafted challenge. That said, with the exception of Advent, I do have a soft spot for these games, and I really like them on the whole. I even kinda want to continue playing them, with the belief that I have enough time with them in to make the runs go smoother. Each one took me, on average, between 6 and 7 hours, and while I don't think I'll ever get to the point where I can speedrun them, I could see myself cutting a half hour off my time here, a full hour there. The games are really cool, and there are a lot of options to make them a bit easier, so I would recommend giving the collection a look. Since I beat them normally when I was younger, I didn't permit myself to use the extra checkpoints, so as long as you're not too proud like me, I think Mega Man and platformer fans in general can get a lot of enjoyment out of it. So, to reiterate, ZX and Zero are done. Finally done. That was a huge undertaking, and it caused me a lot more grief than I expected, but I'm glad I played through all of the titles, and with the collection off the list, I am now down to 115 total. I already have 2 more games started up, another hard one that I'm not sure if I can actually beat, and a more leisurely title that I'm playing with a friend, so we're moving right along. Hopefully I can finish one by next week, but for now, thanks for watching, maybe subscribe if you enjoy this sort of thing, and perhaps I'll see you in the next episode.